Hey everyone. So this isn't the type of video I would normally make. I'm usually not the type of guy to just come on the internet, hit record and begin laughing / ranting / emotionally tirading about something in the world of entertainment that in the grand scheme of life's great tapestry just doesn't really matter that much. I don't know, man. That side of YouTube just isn't really my thing, personally. However, very occasionally, and this has become the case with Disney's treatment of Star Wars over the last 12 years, things get to a point where you can't not talk about it. Like, yeah, I did that Star Wars ranked video for May the 4th where I briefly touched upon the sequel trilogy and how it was overall a pretty remarkable failure, but let's just say I never thought I'd be sitting here in the year of our Lord 2024 dedicating an entire video to how bad of a job Disney have done with this IP since they acquired it back in 2012. However, this morning, I read the news that Lucasfilm, collaborating with American filmmaker Simon Kinberg, have begun work on a new trilogy confirmed to be episodes 10, 11, and 12. And I need you guys to believe me when I say this. When I read that piece of news, I burst out laughing because, and I mean seriously people, how on earth have we gotten to this point? What is that point, you ask? Well, if I could sum it up briefly, I basically feel like we've now hit a position in time where more or less 100% of people who hold even a waning interest in Star Wars are less invested in the story which Kathleen Kennedy and Dave Filoni and co are attempting to tell than they are with the far more tragic, bittersweet, emotionally impactful and interesting story of how this once titanic franchise fell to the dirt. We are no longer interested in whatever grand narrative these folks are lethargically trying to spin because, well, it all just feels like rushed conveyor belt fanfiction to meet a quota. However, the epic and truly bizarre downfall of one of the most iconic and popular sagas ever told? Well, now you have my attention, and how could you not? Think about it, if there's one thing Star Wars fans love, it's downfalls. The original trilogy, downfall of the Empire. The prequel trilogy, downfall of the Jedi. People like downfalls because they're emotional and Shakespearean, and the downfall of Star Wars is not only one of the most gripping and tragic tales ever told on the world stage of popular culture, but it's also one of the funniest. Now, let me just preface by saying that I am not the biggest Star Wars fan in the world. In fact, I probably wouldn't even call myself a Star Wars fan, considering that, if we're being honest, I only really like the original trilogy, and if we're being even more honest, I only really like the first two. What I'm saying is that I don't exactly have a strong emotional connection to this franchise in its contemporary state, hence why I probably find it a lot easier to laugh at what Disney has done these past 12 years, compared to people who genuinely have quite a strong attachment to Star Wars and who I imagine are quite miserable at how this once legendary space opera is now being defecated upon and stretched out for as much profit as possible. But whether you are able to laugh at the downfall of Star Wars or not, I think we can all admit that Disney's handling of this once respected saga has been a never-ending and quite catastrophic joke. I mean, I'm talking about Monty Python, the funniest joke in the world levels of joke here. Like, when you really deep it, the downfall of Star Wars is surreal, it's ridiculous. It's the kind of thing you would expect to read about in an Infinite Jest endnote. And if you know what I'm talking about, you'll know how accurate that reference was. But seriously, think about it. Star Wars was once one of the most respected and beloved franchises in the world. In fact, this wasn't even that long ago. There's a reason that even now you can go back and watch the original trilogy and, for a few hours, completely forget about all the noise, controversy, and cancer which now rots at the very core of this intellectual property. Because whatever you want to say about George Lucas, the guy had a truly original vision back in the 70s. To blend classical mythic storytelling with groundbreaking special effects into a timeless epic between good and evil, which captures imaginations and sets a new standard for cinematic storytelling. But on top of this, He also understood how Hollywood works, and from the beginning adopted a cautious stance towards the mainstream film industry, wary of the studio-driven formulas that prioritized profit over artistic vision. Now, of course, this isn't to say that George Lucas never cared about money, that would be silly, but he was aware of how Hollywood favored risk-free blockbusters over original ideas, and famously retained a high level of creative control for all his projects. And to be honest, I would argue that this independent, unrestrained spirit was a huge reason as to why the original trilogy was so excellent. The word I personally like to use to describe those movies, especially the first two, is magic, which may sound a little melodramatic in my dry British accent, but seriously, go back and rewatch the scene from Empire where Yoda lifts Luke's X-Wing out of the Dagobah swamp, and tell me that this franchise doesn't have certain magical properties. But here's the funny thing, even after the original trilogy wrapped up, Star Wars never really lost that magic. Obviously, I'm too young to have lived through most of this stuff, but I get the impression that even throughout the 80s, where there was basically nothing new coming out of the franchise, through to the 90s with the expanded universe, and even during the years of the critically panned prequel trilogy, Star Wars still had that spark of originality and spirit that made it so special in the first place, at least for most fans. And look, I've made my feelings on the prequels clear before on this channel. I think they are bad films, I think they are even worse Star Wars films, and I find the whole re-evaluation of these movies, which I would argue my very own generation is responsible for, to be one of the single most surreal and alienating occurrences in the history of humankind. But even I can admit that the prequel trilogy, despite in my opinion completely failing both as movies and as a satisfactory backstory to Anakin Skywalker, well, they miraculously still have that magic just about. Don't get me wrong, it's nowhere near as blatant as it is in the original trilogy, where it feels like each frame, each line, each costume, each prop is just bursting with cinematic wizardry and boldness and originality, but that fundamental essence, that magic, it is still there in the prequel trilogy. You just have to look quite hard to find it. In fact, you may just have to wait a couple of decades to pass for them to become nostalgic, and for there to be an even worse trilogy released for you to find it, but hey, that's what's been happening recently. Because while the prequels are definitely bad films, and I'd like to think even fans of the trilogy can at least partially agree with me there, they are not bad in the way pretty much all modern bad films are bad. And I think this is a really integral and often overlooked reason as to why there has been such a re-evaluation of these movies and this overall era of Star Wars. See, I feel like most people's complaints with contemporary popular cinema these days boils down to a lack of originality and boldness. A lack of sincerity, a lack of imagination, a lack of soul. Most blockbusters nowadays, which are actually shown in theaters to the general public, feel like they are made by studio executives and board directors instead of artists, and the Star Wars sequel trilogy is perhaps the single best example of this. The prequels, on the other hand, I mean, sure, I could sit here for hours detailing all of the problems those films have, but you cannot deny that they are original, and bold, and sincere, and imaginative, and clearly made by someone with a vision unperturbed by Hollywood higher-ups. And sure, many people cite George Lucas's unchecked sovereignty and the inability of those around him to say no, or you've gone too far, George, or this isn't Star Wars, George, to be the main reason that the prequels failed so spectacularly in so many ways. But I would argue that on the other side of that coin, it's also what gives the prequels just that slight spark, immediately setting them apart from the non-stop conveyor belt of corporate sludge we get nowadays from the likes of Disney and streaming services, such as Disney Plus. I'm sorry, Disney. Honestly, this is all just revenge for shutting down Toontown. Why did you have to shut down Toontown? I was this close to the wedding cake. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is that I think we can learn quite a lot about contemporary audiences and what they look for in contemporary blockbusters by studying the wave of prequel love which has been steadily building over the last, I don't know, 10, 15 years? Because I'm pretty sure that most people nowadays would take that spark of originality and heart which the prequels have every day of the week and twice on a Sunday over a film which is technically superior, but artistically and or spiritually empty, if that makes sense. And honestly, I get it. It's why I was so fascinated by Francis Ford Coppola's Megalopolis, which kind of reminded me of the prequels in lots of ways, given that it was a huge misfire that I did not enjoy watching, but was also a wholly original and passionate piece of work that I couldn't help but kind of respect. Anyway, this all leads us to, of course, Disney's acquisition of Lucasfilm on October the 30th, 2012. Now, I was born in 2001, so I just about remember when this happened, but if you're a bit younger, you might be surprised to hear that this new story was actually met with lots of positivity and buzz. It's kind of funny to look back on it now, but at the time, taking this intellectual property away from its seemingly out-of-touch creator and giving it to a Hollywood titan, the studio who had just dropped The Avengers, well, it seemed like a great idea, and this was actually a great time to be a Star Wars fan. The speculation and excitement and passion was off the charts. This was back when you could actually mention Star Wars in real life or on the internet, and not immediately be met with a wave of rolling eyes and groans. And if you ever want to feel this really weird sense of bittersweet nostalgia in your gut, go look up fan posters for episode 7 before we knew anything about the actual film. It's really weird. It's like looking at the concept art for the prequel trilogy. All you can really do is stand there and imagine an alternate reality where, you know, things were better. Because as we all know, this excitement for new Star Wars was, in hindsight, wildly misplaced. Not only can I not think of a franchise downfall more poetic, tragic, and downright funny than Star Wars, but honestly, if I were in charge of Lucasfilm or Disney, I'm not sure I could have done a better job at ruining this beloved space opera myself. It's actually quite impressive, quite remarkable, at how well they have managed to drive this franchise into the ground in just 12 years. Now, for many fans, the moment they first begun to question Disney's commitment to Star Wars' legacy was when the company decided to erase the expanded universe from canon. And while I can understand this decision from both an artistic and business perspective, I also get why many fans felt hurt by this creative decision, especially those who had invested countless hours into the books, comics, video games, and everything else that made up the expanded universe. I get the impression that for lots of people, the expanded universe was their Star Wars. However, there was still a lot of goodwill and understanding and empathy with Disney, and I think a lot of people around this time just adopted the mindset that this was all for the greater good. And that with a blank slate, Disney could thrive creatively and make some incredible new Star Wars content that would bring about world peace and end racism. And then we got The Force Awakens trailers. And this was surely the peak of Disney Star Wars fandom, not just because we were seeing lightsabers and X-Wings again, but because honestly these are some of the best trailers ever made. I'm being serious, the editing, the needle drops, the iconography, I feel like even the biggest Disney skeptics in the world must have gotten goosebumps back in 2015 when they first saw that shot of the Millennium Falcon. Then the movie actually came out, it was not great, so now going back to watch these incredible trailers feels like watching your parents' wedding video after they get divorced. This is not my joke, by the way, it's the top comment on the first Force Awakens teaser, and yeah, nice one GTF Blade, you nailed it. The Force Awakens is a very strange film. I imagine if you screened it on an alien planet, one which had cinema but not Star Wars, the majority of the population would call it an inoffensive, decently made but overall kind of forgettable science fiction fantasy space opera. However, with the full context of what Star Wars was, what Star Wars is, and what Star Wars could potentially be in the right hands, The Force Awakens transforms into one of the most lazy and shallow movies ever created. Like, again, it's quite surreal and hilarious to just think about this film's existence. Now, of course, when The Force Awakens initially dropped, it was a huge success. It received relatively good reviews from both critics and fans, and to this day it is the highest grossing film in the history of the North American box office. However, that doesn't mean that the movie didn't have its detractors. At first there weren't many of them, they were kind of shunned to the sidelines of the internet, but soon enough more and more people were realizing that The Force Awakens had a ton of problems. Until we got to the point I feel like we're at now where basically no one thinks this film is good anymore. Now, this is just me talking personally, you don't have to agree with me, but here are two commonly cited reasons why Star Wars Episode 7 was supposedly bad, which personally I don't actually agree with. Number one, anything to do with politics. It's honestly both hilarious and a little sad to me, that out of the basically endless list of reasons you could choose as to why the sequel trilogy was terrible, some people genuinely point to political agendas as the single biggest issue. And yeah, it's funny, but it's also kind of annoying because they make people like me who genuinely posit valid criticisms about writing and storytelling look bad. That's my opinion anyway. The second thing I never really got is the complete uproar which you hear to this day over the fact that the plot of The Force Awakens is similar to the plot of the original Star Wars, or A New Hope if you want to call it that. This one I'm far more sympathetic towards, but it does still, in my opinion, kind of miss the mark on why exactly this film is so bad. Don't get me wrong, I think people who talk about this are in the right ballpark, but whenever I personally watch The Force Awakens, which is probably like 3 or 4 times in my entire life, I'm not sat there thinking, oh my god, this thing's structure is so similar to Episode 4. No, I'm thinking, oh my god, they have literally ruined everything about the original trilogy and we're only at the title crawl. To me, the reason why The Force Awakens is such a unique catastrophe has nothing to do with the fact that it takes place on a sand planet, and that there is a droid who is carrying information, but that it completely destroys and disrespects everything that came before it while offering up nothing new of any substance. To put it another way, I don't dislike The Force Awakens because it's a remake, but because it's some weird, empty legacy reboot. It's clear when watching this movie that Disney had no intention of ever attempting to actually tell a proper story. Like I said, by the title crawl, both the universe and the heroes who inhabit it have reverted back to their pre-Episode 4 starting positions. Yes, believe it or not, J.J. Abrams and Kathleen Kennedy and co. fell into the classic trap of thinking that the only way to do a sequel is to destroy everything that came before it and start again. That the only way to make money is to go as safe as humanly possible. Hence, we have a movie that doesn't even feel like a movie as much as it feels like the product of a corporate brainstorming session. It's empty, it's lifeless, it doesn't feel excited to tell a new story, and the magic is just not there. However, hindsight is 2020, and I guess you could argue that there was still some hope for this franchise. I mean, I wouldn't. But you could, for surely now a solid base had been established. Disney could continue moving forward with their bold and exciting blueprint for the entire trilogy which they had obviously planned out beforehand. Then The Last Jedi came out, and we all learned the hard way that there was zero plan in place at all, which, again, quite surreal to think about really. Not only because it's a terrible and pointless storytelling decision, but also because it's a baffling business decision. Like, honestly, what reason was there to not plan out to the sequel trilogy? Especially when you hire a man who loves mystery boxes more than Nikolai Belinsky. Oh, what a reference. But honestly, the only reasons I can think of as to why Disney made such a short-sighted decision are 1, a blind arrogance, and 2, a desire to religiously follow the formula of the original trilogy, which were also written one at a time and which had 3 different directors. But honestly, the fact that no one throughout the entire production of The Force Awakens said, hey, yeah, we need a plan for this, is just unbelievable. And it's honestly why I don't really harbour any ill will towards The Last Jedi or Rian Johnson, because looking back, the franchise was already doomed. Disney were never going to pull off the gargantuan task of delivering a worthy sequel trilogy in an environment where 1, money is the singular goal, 2, where there are just so many deadlines and quotas to hit, 3, where George Lucas is nowhere to be seen, and 4, where they don't even bother to plan anything out. Like, obviously that iconic Star Wars magic I was talking about earlier, that spark of originality and imagination, that idea of a singular mythic vision of rolling the dice, obviously it was never going to be created within the boardrooms of Walt Disney Studios under those conditions. Like, don't get me wrong, I don't really like The Last Jedi and basically agree with all the standard criticisms which have been thrown at it over the years, but to be honest guys, I don't know if this movie ever had a chance of being good. And honestly, I think I'd rather watch Rian Johnson having some fun with the extinguished remains of the torch J.J. Abrams attempted to pass him over either The Force Awakens or The Rise of Skywalker, the latter of which I genuinely believe to be one of the worst films of all time, which is essentially just 2 hours and 22 minutes of Disney trying and failing to mop up their multitude of past mistakes, leaving little to no time to actually, you know, wrap up the legendary, iconic space opera the gods should never have allowed them to buy. So, that's the sequel trilogy. Which in my opinion is the biggest piece of the puzzle as to why Disney Star Wars is such a joke. Because the truth is, most people don't care about the books or the video games or even the TV shows. Most people only know the films. It was always going to be the most important thing for Disney to get right, and they just failed in such a beautiful, poetic, and legendary fashion, didn't they? Honestly, I think one of the funniest things to me is just how much they rushed into everything. Like, may I remind you, The Force Awakens came out only 3 years after the Disney takeover, which may sound like a lot of time, but it really isn't. Not when you're dealing with such a huge, iconic franchise with such a passionate and diverse fan base. But honestly, the deeper you research into the production of this trilogy, the more embarrassing it gets. The whole thing was just such a rush job, and once again, nothing of lasting quality was ever going to be produced in those conditions. I really have no idea what the higher-ups at Disney were thinking, but I guess at the end of the day it does just come down to money and arrogance. Like, if there was ever going to be a chance of this sequel trilogy actually being a success, Disney would first have needed to acknowledge the enormity and complexity of the task at hand. They would have needed to gather a bunch of people in a room who actually know and love Star Wars, the main one obviously being George Lucas, you know, the guy who is responsible for all of this. And they would have needed to have lengthy discussions about what this sequel trilogy should be, what direction they should take the story which makes sense, which both casual and die-hard fans will appreciate. Because whatever you want to say about the prequels, the OG complete saga of Star Wars, being episodes 1 through 6, tells its own self-contained story which is all wrapped up rather nicely in Return of the Jedi. So crafting a worthwhile episode 7, and to a greater extent crafting a worthwhile sequel trilogy, well, it was always going to require a certain level of humility and patience and proper planning. So why Disney, the multi-billion-dollar company, thought that rushing a spiritually empty legacy reboot, in the process undoing all the character and plot progression from the original trilogy, why they thought this was a good idea from either a storytelling or a business perspective is truly beyond me. And it's so obvious now just how short-term and emotional Disney's mindset was when making these movies. It's like they got drunk one night and impulsively bought a cow off of eBay, only for it to arrive the next morning, and now they have a cow in their living room, and they're just desperately milking it without any regard for the long-term well-being of either themselves or the cow. And eventually they start choosing neighbors at random to come into their house and milk this poor cow, and it's like, guys, get a bucket, treat the cow with some respect, maybe feed it once in a while. Is this analogy making sense? I don't know. My point is that Disney's strategy for the sequel trilogy does not make any sense. It seems to me like they basically just immediately panicked and went, shit, we need to make a Star Wars movie. Hey, Star Trek kind of sounds like Star Wars, let's bring in the guy who did those passable Star Trek movies to make one of the most important films in the history of our company. Nope, don't question it, there isn't enough time, just get it done. Oh no, people thought that movie was too safe, well let's hire Rian Johnson and give him complete creative control. Oh no, he created like the most controversial film ever made. Quick, bring J.J. Abrams back to steady the ship. It seems to me that at no point throughout this whole process were Disney actually on the front foot. Everything they've done since acquiring Lucasfilm can basically be boiled down to covering up a past mistake, or at least attempting to. In fact, if you want to watch the best video on the Star Wars sequels, and honestly one of the greatest video essays I have ever watched, check out this video by So Uncivilized titled The Star Wars Sequels Disney's Anti-Trilogy. I mean, you've probably seen it already considering it's got like 4.5 million views, but in case you haven't, he basically argues that each film in the sequel trilogy is less a story with its own meaning and purpose, and more just a reaction to something else, leaving each entry feeling incredibly hollow and without real substance. And I would say this is really when Star Wars became a joke, when it entered its banter era, if you will, the era we still find ourselves in today. I still think and laugh about the fact that J.J. Abrams brought the Emperor back for the final film and claimed that it was the plan the entire time. Like, JJ, just be honest, man. People would respect you more if you just admitted that no one had any idea what they were doing. This was also around the time where online Star Wars discussions began to intensify online. let's say. I honestly wonder how many people have made a living by just piling in on Disney Star Wars day after day, whose actual job it is to just make those videos with the hyper-emotional thumbnails complaining about wokeness and claiming Kathleen Kennedy is the human form of Satan from John Milton's epic poem Paradise Lost. In fact, these days the Star Wars fandom is one of the most chaotic and hilarious battlegrounds you'll be able to find across the entire internet. However, despite all of the toxic matter you'll find down there, I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel kind of sorry for Star Wars fans, especially the overwhelming majority of them who are just decent, passionate people. I don't think I've ever witnessed a company disrespect a beloved franchise so aggressively before. And what makes it even worse, but also more surreal, is that Disney doesn't even seem interested in hiding the fact that they have no idea what they are doing and that they only care about turnover. Because here's the thing, did George Lucas make mistakes when he was in charge of Star Wars? Yes. Did George Lucas care about money? Well, yeah, of course he did. You don't become a multi-billionaire without caring about money. Yet, through all the road bumps and cash grabs of Lucas's career, you did always genuinely get the impression that the guy cared quite deeply about the work he was doing. Despite Star Wars having always been this gargantuan icon of cinema and, you know, one of the highest grossing media franchises of all time, it always felt different to the other huge names in entertainment. It never quite lost that magical, independent underdog spirit, which had made it such a hit in the first place. To put it another way, despite all the billions of dollars Star Wars made over the years, there was always this feeling that it belonged to the streets, if you will. Which is why I now want to speak directly to Star Wars fans. Not the ones who send death threats to cast members, those people are in serious need of living as a Buddhist monk for a few years, but to the normal Star Wars fans, your everyday people who just want to see their favourite franchise respected and honoured. Listen to these words. You honestly have a right to be angry. Because what Disney have done to Star Wars over the last 12 years is a truly surreal and quite incredible destruction of art and magic on a scale I don't think we've ever seen before. And watching those 3 movies, seeing what Disney did to the world and characters we love so much, it almost feels like this was their intention. And yes, it is funny because of how embarrassingly and publicly Disney have messed up this dream opportunity, but it's also kind of tragic because once again, Star Wars used to be the golden child. You used to be able to talk about Star Wars openly without fear of judgment and/or controversy. In fact, it was once fun, believe it or not, to celebrate this franchise. And to see all of that fun and magic just be completely drained by some grey, lifeless corporate leech and its endless conveyor belt of mind-numbingly unimaginative and rushed projects, well, it's sad, and it's perhaps even more sad that we've now gotten to a point where these huge studios don't even care to hide how greedy and incompetent they are. It's like some small bit of magic has just been lost. Not from Star Wars, but from the world in general. Yes, Disney have picked up a few wins in the last 12 years, the most obvious of which being Andor. An insanely good show which proved what can happen when you hire the right people and give them a solid level of creative freedom. But if anything, Andor's level of quality was a complete anomaly, which proves to me more than anything else that Disney do not know what they are doing. I don't want to call it a fluke, because I think that would be unfair on Tony Gilroy and the rest of the Andor team, who clearly put their heart and soul into the show, but it was clearly an accidental masterpiece from Disney, not one which I imagine they will be able to repeat again, especially if the last couple of years since Andor's release is anything to go by. In 2023, we got the announcement for 3 new Star Wars films, which was funny for 2 reasons. First of all, because Disney have made a habit since acquiring Lucasfilm of announcing projects as early as humanly possible, only to sweep them under the rug when they inevitably fall apart, never to be spoken of again. Just off the top of my head, we had Patty Jenkins's Rogue Squadron, we had a project from the duo behind the rise and fall of Game of Thrones, remember that show? We had a supposed trilogy coming from Rian Johnson. I think Kevin Feige and Taika Waititi also had stuff going on. However, none of these projects ever saw the light of day, at least not yet. So these days when Disney announce new movies, it's like The Boy Who Cried Wolf, or The Mouse Who Cried give me money. Seriously though, I will be shocked if even 2 of these movies actually hit the theaters, but let's look at what has been announced. The first is a film about the dawn of the Jedi set 25,000 years before the original trilogy, directed by James Mangold. And don't get me wrong, James Mangold is a solid director despite that new Indiana Jones flop. However, the project does overall reek of Disney having just completely run out of ideas. Like, realistically, who actually wants to watch this film? Who wants the magic of the Force explained? I thought we already learnt this lesson with midichlorians or The Legend of Korra. Had to get that in there. The second film is Dave Filoni's culmination of the various Disney Plus shows he's attached to, geniusly titled The Mandalorian and Grogu, and this is the one which I imagine we will definitely see considering it's filming as we speak. I think if this movie had been announced after season 2 of The Mandalorian, it would have been one of Disney's most anticipated releases in years. However, time has not been particularly nice to Dave Filoni, or the Mandoverse as it's called. It's not that people now hate the character and world, just that the goodwill and hype Filoni and of course Jon Favreau had built with those first couple of Mandalorian seasons has definitely dwindled pretty substantially due to the perceived lack of quality in things such as Ahsoka, The Book of Boba Fett, and The Mandalorian Season 3. I guess all we can do is wait to see if this thing is any good. My prediction if it does come out is that it will be decent, but that it just won't make that much money, as is often the case with these movies which require tons of homework to even understand. Which brings us to the third and final film announced, which was the Rey movie, set 15 years after the rise of Skywalker, and which will supposedly focus on the beloved character rebuilding the Jedi Order. Obviously, this was the biggest announcement of the bunch and was met with a great deal of confusion, not only because we still don't know if this is an episode 10 or if it's more of a spin-off kind of thing, but also because why are they making this movie? I mean, no disrespect to Daisy Ridley here, she seems like a nice and normal person who's been thrust into the most toxic work environment imaginable, but let's be real here, the majority of people just don't like Rey, or the sequel trilogy as a whole. Again, it's not a smart creative or business decision, so what are they thinking? What made this announcement sting even more for Star Wars fans was the fact that restoring the Jedi Order to its once great heights has always been Luke Skywalker's destiny, not Rey's. Basically, all Disney have done here is take the original trilogy with all its magic and wonder, replicate it without any of the same character, destroying and invalidating everything that came before, and then just continuing to tell the same story that was originally being told, except we now have no interesting characters or ideas left. And we also now have this really awkward timeline where there were 2 identical wars between a rebellion and a galactic empire, only a few decades apart. And yeah, I know that sort of thing can happen, it basically happened in real life in the 20th century, but come on, let's be real, this is ridiculous. It's an insult to the fans of Star Wars who have dedicated blood, sweat and tears to this franchise. Then there's the case of Sharmeen Obaid-Chinoy, apologies if I mispronounced that name, the movie's supposed director. Now look, I'm sure that she is a very good journalist, political activist and documentary filmmaker, but the truth is that she has never made a live-action fiction film before and is therefore probably not the person you want directing such an important movie for the studio. Again, Disney, what are you doing? No disrespect to Sharmeen, but why are you hiring just the blatantly wrong people? You're acting like such a small company, it's honestly bizarre to watch. This isn't even mentioning The Acolyte, which was of course created by Leslie Headland, the former personal assistant of Harvey Weinstein, and which was basically met with universal groans. I'll be honest, I only watched the first episode, but there was something about it so empty and bland that, I don't know, I never even thought about putting on episode 2. And clearly lots of people shared this sentiment as the series was axed after only 1 season. And all of this finally brings us to the announcement of a new Star Wars trilogy, more specifically episodes 10, 11 and 12, and they're just shameless, aren't they? Like, to me that's the funniest part about all of this. The truth is that if Disney had just held their hands up, accepted failure and decanonized the sequel trilogy, yeah, it would have still been embarrassing, but I imagine most Star Wars fans would eventually have respected Disney for admitting defeat and starting over. But of course, the mouse is a stubborn creature, which is why we've gotten all these shows which attempt to validate Disney's pathetic post-Return of the Jedi canon, and why we're now potentially getting a whole new trilogy written and produced by Simon Kinberg, who, I'll be honest, I'd never even heard of before when reading the news. However, after doing some research, it's clear that he helped out a bit with Star Wars Rebels and The Force Awakens, but is more well known for writing X-Men movies such as The Last Stand and Apocalypse. And Dark Phoenix. Jesus Christ, who is this guy? Nah, but seriously, being nice, Simon Kinberg does have some solid films on his resume as a producer, so perhaps if he were more involved in just steering the project in the right direction, you know, providing ideas but hiring other people to actually write the screenplays and direct, it could work. But honestly, after everything I've seen from this company since they acquired this franchise, I'd be shocked if this trilogy even came out, let alone was actually good. Plus, whatever story you're telling is gonna be set in Disney's weird Frankenstein canon, so honestly, what's the point? You've already messed it up. Also, how does this trilogy link into the Rey movie? Can someone tell me what is going on? But yeah, I think that's going to be it. Disney Star Wars, I'm talking to you directly now, I know you're watching this. Thank you so much for providing so much entertainment over the last 12 years. It's a shame that most of it didn't actually come from the movies and TV shows you have released, but hey man, that's the world we live in. And if this was, in actuality, all some grand scheme to destroy Star Wars from within, you have done an incredible job which will be studied for years to come. Seriously though, if you guys continue to release bland corporate sludge, continue to have no plan in place, continue to disrespect everything that came before, continue to disrespect the fans by saying that Star Wars isn't for them anymore and that they're all racist, homophobic man-childs, or whatever your current strategy is, you will lose in the end, my friends. I'm sorry to be the one to break it to you, but you will lose. And for Star Wars fans, my message is just this. Train yourself to let go of everything you fear to lose. And as always, thank you for watching.